What if the Battle of the Frigidus River in 394 AD had never happened? What if that fateful battle between the eastern forces of Theodosius and Stilicho and the western forces of Eugenius and Arbogast just never occurred? How would that have impacted the further evolution of the Roman Empire? Well, friends of late Roman history, I hope I will be able to convincingly demonstrate that the world in which we would live right now would be a very different one if that fateful battle of world history had never taken place. But how could it have come to this battle? After the death of the Emperor Valentinian II in 392 AD, a quite tragic emperor by the way, about whom I want to make a full video, a new emperor was needed in the West. Incredibly, already in those days, the Western Roman Empire was under the influence of a powerful Magister Militum, a Frank called Arbogast. So we can see that already before Ricimer, before Aetius, and even before Stilicho, the Magister Militum system would start to cause trouble in the Western Roman Empire. It is even thought that Arbogast might have played a part in the death of the Emperor Valentinian II. Ironically, it was Theodosius himself who had made Arbogast Magister Militum of the West, following his victory over the usurper Magnus Maximus some years prior. So after the emperor died, officially from suicide, Arbogast proclaimed Eugenius as the new Western Roman emperor, a rhetorician who resided in Rome and who was religiously very tolerant. Under Eugenius, the old Greco-Roman temples of Rome were opened for the last time in Roman history, and the old traditional religion of the Roman Empire was allowed to be practiced openly for the last time in the Western Roman Empire. Officially, Eugenius was a Christian, but in those days many openly pretended to be Christians to gain access to high-ranking state offices, while in secret they still worshipped the old gods. This practice, called crypto-paganism, was quite common and widespread and persisted to a lower degree even into the 6th and later centuries. Theodosius now, instead of accepting Eugenius as new Western co-emperor, decided to wage war against the West. He assembled an army under command of the legendary Flavius Stilicho, employed his Gothic foederati soldiers and marched west. Eugenius and Arbogast met Theodosius's and Stilicho's forces in September of the year 394 AD at the Frigidus River, probably the modern river Vipava in modern-day Slovenia. I will discuss in detail in a separate video the exact events of that battle, but suffice it to say that even despite heavy losses, especially to the Gothic mercenary soldiers, Theodosius won, and Eugenius and Arbogast in the aftermath of this defeat died, the former by execution, the latter by committing suicide. The consequences of this battle were manifold, and there was not one single good consequence of this battle for the Roman Empire. A large part of the Western Roman comitatenses and limitanae troops was destroyed, and since recruiting new soldiers into the ranks of the Roman army had become extremely difficult due to reasons that I discussed in this video here, these lost legions could not easily be replenished. This would have several direct consequences for the Roman Empire. Firstly, the loss of many Western comitatenses and limitanae would force the Western Empire to recruit more barbarian mercenaries who were not as loyal as the Roman soldiers. Secondly, Stilicho, who later became the defender and Magister Militum and effective ruler of the West, had less high-quality comitatenses soldiers at his disposal, forcing him to withdraw soldiers from the Rhine frontier for the defense of Italy. In fact, a large part of the Western army of Eugenius and Arbogast was made up of soldiers from the Rhine frontier, which they themselves had already withdrawn from that important border. This weakening of the border forces along the Rhine River would directly result in the breach of the frontier in early 407 AD by a large coalition of Germanic tribes, which in the following years thus managed to overrun Gallia and Hispania. They then established their own de facto kingdoms on Western Roman territory, which would destabilize and weaken the Western Roman Empire and reduce its tax revenue, leading to the catastrophic chain reaction that would see the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. And it all started in 407 AD, and the withdrawal of massive amounts of troops before and after the Battle of the Frigidus River from the Rhine was a major cause for that catastrophe. The third disastrous consequence of that fateful battle was that Theodosius, having won, he placed his two incompetent sons on the western and eastern thrones of the empire respectively, and both would play a pivotal role in the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. Arcadius in the east, but even more importantly Honorius in the west, would prove to be quite incapable emperors that made some very bad decisions. Especially Honorius would be the emperor that would, through a chain of catastrophic decisions, see the Western Empire dangerously weakened. And the final consequence was that Theodosius was a religiously very intolerant emperor, and so the religious intolerance of Christianity towards the old traditional Greco-Roman faith greatly increased under Theodosius and his dynasty, which caused many religious riots throughout the Roman Empire and greatly polarized Roman society, which would further destabilize the Imperium Romanum. Thus we see how incredibly momentous the consequences of that fateful battle actually were. But what if that battle never happened? But before we get to that, if you want to support this channel but you think that Patreon or YouTube membership doesn't give you enough benefits, then please support the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is a unique online learning community with thousands of online classes across 150 countries that enables you to learn new skills in a fun way. You want personal growth? You want to acquire new skills for your business? On Skillshare you can find classes for anything, from learning how to edit, to the art of illustration, to programming and more. Skillshare has it all. I personally tried out Kat Coquillette's course Learn Adobe Photoshop Fundamentals for Getting Started in order to freshen up my Photoshop skills, because I previously mostly used GIMP so that I can do some better 3D layered drawings and animations for the channel. In 12 lessons that are in total only 1.5 hours long, Kat Coquillette explains really nicely how to use Photoshop in order to edit images in quite elaborate ways. Fascinatingly, I really learned some new tricks, and I was quite amazed by how easy and fast I could learn this with Skillshare. You can do the same or something similar by using this special Maiorianus Skillshare link here, which you can also find in the description. You then get a 1-month free trial offer for Skillshare. But don't hesitate for too long, because this offer is only valid for the first 1,000 people. And by using this link, you at the same time also support this channel here. Julius Valerius Maiorianus would be proud. Gratias tibiago, amici. So back to the Battle of the Frigidus River. What if that battle never happened? For instance, we can imagine that Valentinian II had not met an early death. Instead, he somehow managed to get rid of Arbogast and to restore the power of the office of emperor in the west. That would have prevented the civil war, since Valentinian II was recognized by Theodosius as legitimate Western Roman emperor. Or alternatively, we can imagine that Theodosius's character would have been slightly different, and he decided not to elevate his son Honorius to Western Emperor in 393 AD, thus effectively declaring Eugenius's rule as illegitimate. He could have accepted Eugenius in the West, something which is not entirely unrealistic, as such events did transpire in the later course of history, so it would have not been completely unthinkable that Theodosius could have decided to simply accept Eugenius's rule, and instead have focused on restoring the ranks of the Eastern Roman legions after they were still weakened from the losses of the Battle of Adrianople. The timeline in which Valentinian II would have survived would differ from that in which Eugenius would have been accepted as Western Roman Emperor by Theodosius. Eugenius was religiously much more tolerant than Valentinian II, and so we can imagine that Greco-Roman polytheism would have been allowed to continue in the West far longer than in our timeline under the rule of Eugenius. We don't know how old Eugenius was at his acclamation to emperor in 392, but he could not have been that old. His image on his coinage reminds us of the Emperor Julian, so an age in his mid-30s to early 40s seems plausible. He thus could have reigned for many more years, and he might even have established his own Eugenian dynasty. This might have developed into a dynasty of religious tolerance and a renewal of Greco-Roman polytheism in the West, with possibly long-lasting consequences for the religious landscape of Western Europe. Had Valentinian II remained alive, then the religious landscape of later years would more closely resemble that of our timeline, namely the further suppression of Greco-Roman polytheism. Valentinian II was not quite as religiously intolerant as Honorius after him, but he still did not restore the altar of victory, the old symbol of the Senate, to the Curia Julia, which had been removed by his predecessor Gratian. That statue of the goddess Victory represented a pagan symbol in the eyes of Christian emperors and was thus removed from the Senate House. Eugenius in fact had restored the altar of Victory to the Senate House in 392 AD and had all the Greco-Roman temples reopened. So under Eugenius and his dynasty, Greco-Roman polytheism could have seen a much longer lasting revival in the Western Roman Empire than in our timeline. But in both cases, in the Valentinian II and Eugenius timeline, an even bigger consequence would have been that the Western Roman Empire might have never fallen, or if, then much later than in our timeline. Why? Well, we found that one of the single biggest events that would lead to a catastrophic chain reaction that would culminate in the fall of the Western Roman Empire was the breaching of the Rhine frontier by many Germanic tribes, Vandals, Burgundians, Suevi Goths, Alani and others, into Gallia and Hispania. I talked in great detail about why this event was so disastrous and how brutal it was in these videos here. In short, it led in several waves to the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. And we have learned that Eugenius and Arbogast had to withdraw many Comitatenses and Limitanei from the Rhine frontier in order to fight Theodosius' Eastern Roman army. And later Stilicho would do the same again, and so further deplete the forces of the Rhine frontier in order to successfully defend Italy from the incursions of Radagaisus and Alaric in 402, 405 and 406. But that very withdrawal of troops from the Rhine frontier due to the Battle of the Frigidus River directly resulted in the breaching of that frontier. Only the Frankish foederati soldiers that had been recruited as federate limitanei by the earlier emperors of the 4th century were left to defend the Rhine. Surprisingly, they initially actually even managed to fend off the Vandals, and it is said that as many as 20,000 Vandals died against the Franks. But later, the Alani and other Germanic tribes joined the Vandals, and thus the Franks had to give up. But had the Battle of the Frigidus never happened, the Rhine borders would have been protected additionally by tens of thousands of high-quality Comitatensis legions that would have been still stationed in 407 in many castellums along the Rhine, and in addition by tens of thousands of Limitanei soldiers. Thus, the Frankish foederati, together with the Limitanei and Comitatenses, would have, in this alternate timeline, quite likely successfully managed to drive back the Germanic invaders in early 407 AD. Consequently, Gallia and Hispania would never have been ravaged by the Vandals, Burgundians, Visigoths, Alani, Suevi and others. These Germanic tribes would then have never managed to establish their kingdoms on territory of the Western Roman Empire. Constantine III would have never rebelled in Britannia, taking with him all the Roman legions from Britain in 407 AD. Britannia would have remained part of the Western Roman Empire. The Vandals would have never crossed into Africa, as happened in our timeline after 429, since they would have never even arrived in Hispania in the first place. In that timeline, where the Battle of the Frigidus River never happened, I think it is very likely that all these Germanic tribes would have been settled along the Rhine frontier, similar to how it happened with the Franks decades earlier and similar to how it happened after the crisis of the 3rd century with many Germanic tribes. These tribes would have over the course of the next decades become powerful Limitanei federates in the service of Rome, and thus the Hunnic invasion of the 440s and early 450s would have been combated much more effectively. It is quite likely that the Huns would not have managed to breach into the Western Roman Empire in that timeline, and instead of a battle of the Catalonian plains, we would have seen a battle somewhere on the Rhine frontier where the Huns would have been defeated. the Western Roman Empire would have survived, and this tumultuous time would have been remembered as the crisis of the 5th century. In this alternate timeline, we can imagine the Western Roman Empire later helping the Eastern Roman Empire against the Persian and the Muslim invasions of the 7th century. With a surviving Western Empire, Egypt, the Levant, and Northern Africa in general would have stayed Roman, and so possibly our world would look very different right now. We cannot know how or if the Western Roman Empire would have dissolved later, but there is a real chance that it simply would not have. It might have continued, and through a process of long cultural transformation, might at some point have resembled some form of the Eastern Roman Empire in our timeline. But in the Eugenius timeline though, Greco-Roman temples might have been kept in use and repaired, and Greco-Roman polytheism might have survived much longer, and so the urban landscape and architecture of European cities would have been vastly different. And without the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Middle Ages would not have happened in the form that we know. So therefore, this one single battle might possibly have decided the fate of the entire world. And how the planet would look if that battle had never happened is something that utterly fascinates me, and I hope I could also excite your imagination. What do you think would have happened, dear friends of late Roman history, had this fateful battle never taken place? Let me know in the comment section. And I would be very happy if you would like this video and subscribe, so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. And I would especially like to thank our new Kaiser supporters, David Pagno and John Schneider. Thank you so much, David Pagno and John Schneider, for supporting this channel in such a generous way. This channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any form. You guys are amazing. Gratias tibiago, amici. And if you want to learn more about how the Rhine frontier was breached in our timeline, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. And if you want to learn why this breaching of the Rhine frontier was so extremely brutal for the Roman Empire, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.